It was an early morning on March 7, 2020, and Toronto Pearson International Airport was already buzzing with activity. While Air Canada flight AC-1037, an Embraer E190, was taxiing into position for takeoff, another aircraft, Air Canada flight AC-606, which was a huge Boeing 777, was also getting ready to depart on the same runway. The E190 started its takeoff roll, unaware that within the next few seconds, a bird strike would trigger a chain of events. The Boeing 777 behind it was cleared to take off, assuming that E190 would vacate the runway in time. As the smaller aircraft suddenly decelerated, the larger jet accelerated, triggering a hair-raising sequence of events. This is the incredible story of Air Canada Flight 1037 and Flight 606. The incident took place at the Toronto Pearson International Airport on 7th March 2020, which is the busiest airport in Canada. Toronto's weather on the day was great for aviation with a clear sky, 5 degrees Celsius temperature, and visibility far beyond 10 kilometers. Gentle winds were blowing from the east at an appropriate angle to runway 6L, which was the exit runway for both flights. Flight 1037 was a scheduled Embraer E190 that flew a short-haul route to Denver, Colorado. On board were 83 passengers and 4 flight crew. The twin General Electric CF-34 engines were fully operational at the time of departure. Flight 606 was a Boeing 777-300ER going to Halifax, Nova Scotia. There were 345 people on board and 14 crew members, making a total of 359. The Boeing 777 was enormous in comparison to the E190, with its GE90 engines, and produced a staggering 110,000 pounds of thrust. On this particular day, the Boeing 777's deployment was unusual for the Halifax route, which typically uses smaller aircraft. The choice of aircraft may have been influenced by pandemic travel chaos in early 2020. The records showed that the flight crews of both aircraft were properly licensed and compliant with current regulations for the flights. The air traffic services controller involved was also licensed and qualified for his role. He had been employed by Navi Canada and working at Toronto Pearson International Airport CYYZ since 2004, bringing extensive experience as a controller and instructor. Both pilots had undergone extensive training in the handling of rejected takeoffs and high-speed aborts. Little did they know that these abilities would soon be put to the test. Both planes were scheduled to take off from runway 6L, a 3,300-meter stretch. At 9:50 a.m., ATC authorized the Embraer E190 for takeoff while following standard protocol. The Boeing 777 was to follow the E190 once it had reached a safe distance and speed. The E190 initiated its takeoff roll and started accelerating smoothly. As the aircraft reached approximately 70 knots, a bird, which was later identified as a red-tailed hawk, struck its left engine. This created a loud thud and a sudden vibration. Recognizing the risk, the pilots initiated a rejected takeoff and brought the aircraft to a halt. At the same time, the Boeing 777 started its own takeoff roll, accelerating rapidly down the same runway. The stage was set for a high-stakes scenario. The E190 rejected its takeoff at a speed of 135 knots, which was just moments before the Boeing 777 began its roll and reached 80 knots. Despite the takeoff being rejected, a wrong transponder message from the E190 led to reporting that the aircraft was still airborne. This incorrect data significantly delayed the air traffic controller's recognition of the emerging threat. The first sign of trouble was the bird strike. The impact, though not catastrophic, immediately raised concerns about potential engine damage or ingestion, particularly as the remains of the bird were later identified as those of a red-tailed hawk, a species large enough to pose a significant threat to engine performance. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, the crew of the E190 immediately decided to execute a rejected takeoff, a high-stress maneuver requiring precise execution. They quickly completed the rejected takeoff checklist, which included deploying maximum reverse thrust, braking aggressively, and steering the aircraft to a safe halt while maintaining control. However, a critical breakdown in communication occurred almost simultaneously. As the E190 pilots transmitted their message to air traffic control, informing them of the rejected takeoff, their radio call collided with a transmission from the Boeing 777 crew who were acknowledging their own takeoff clearance. The E190's communication was completely drowned out by the stronger radio signal from the Boeing 777, thus ATC, and the speeding Boeing 777 crew were unaware of what was happening on the same runway in front of them. Subsequent analysis revealed that the two transmissions overlapped each other within 1/100th of a second, making them virtually impossible to distinguish in real time. The overlap lasted for about 3 seconds, which was long enough to mask the critical part of the message the E190 was trying to get across. In this crucial time, the pilots of the Boeing 777 did not stop their takeoff roll, believing that the E190 had already become airborne. While a bird strike is not uncommon, it can have severe consequences depending on the location and severity of the impact. If the bird is somehow ingested in the engine, it can cause the compressor to stall, vibrations, and even complete engine failure. Further structural damage can lead to an impairment of some of critical systems such as the hydraulics or avionics. In this situation, the crew of E190 was uncertain whether the bird had caused severe damage. Playing safe, they rejected takeoff, though they could not communicate their decision to ATC as well as to the trailing aircraft, in the situation which increased the risks exponentially. This overlap in communications meant that the 777 ahead of it had rejected its takeoff. As the E190 was decelerating, the transponder generated a faulty signal report, indicating that the airplane had taken off. This erroneous signal originated from the inertial navigation system of the airplane, which interpreted the fast deceleration to be a temporary liftoff. Based on this data, the Runway Incursion Monitoring and Conflict Alert System, RIMCAST, failed to issue a warning. Meanwhile, the Boeing 777, now at 200 kilometers per hour, was rapidly closing the distance. The pilots, still under the impression that the runway was clear, proceeded with their takeoff. The sheer speed and weight of the 777 made deceleration increasingly challenging. At this crucial point, the attention of the air traffic controller shifted to another runway, which was runway 5. This further compounded the issue. With their back turned to the incident unfolding on the runway 6L, the controller was unaware of the E190's rejection and the 777's acceleration. It was only when the crew of the Boeing 777 caught a visual glimpse of the slowing E190 that they realized their situation was grave. The larger airplane was closing into its decision speed, V1, the speed at or above which a takeoff attempt cannot be aborted safely. This gave the crew fewer than seconds to determine a course of action for the rapidly approaching threat. The captain of the 777 had a choice to make: attempt a premature liftoff with insufficient runway or abort the takeoff and risk a potentially disastrous runway overrun. Assessing the situation and recognizing the danger of insufficient altitude and speed to clear the E190, the captain opted for the latter. The crew applied maximum braking force, which engaged the auto brake system at its highest setting, and deployed spoilers to maximize drag. Alarms sounded urgently inside the cockpit, adding to the tension of the already dire situation. As the plane sped toward the threshold, the first officer kept calling out the remaining runway distances. The immense velocity of the fully loaded wide-body jet tested the brakes and systems to their limits as the 777 quickly decelerated but approached the limit of its stopping capability. Every second and every action counted as the crew worked to avert a disaster. The Embraer E190's rejected takeoff was an unexpected and startling experience for the passengers. Few people knew why, but many experienced the forceful braking and heard the rumble of deceleration. On the Boeing 777, the experience was more intense. Passengers gripped their seats as a result of the swift deceleration and the sight of the smaller aircraft up ahead. Some reported hearing the distinctive whine of the engine spooling down and the screech of tires as the massive aircraft came to a halt. It was at this point that the Boeing 777 captain made the decision to commit to the rejected takeoff. The choice was dangerous, but it was a commitment based on a strong sense of protecting both of the aircraft. The crew reacted swiftly to the emergency, focusing on preventing a potentially disastrous collision, even if it meant the absolute wear-out of the aircraft's braking systems. As the 777 began to decelerate, intense braking caused tire temperatures to shoot up dramatically, and the brake discs glowed red-hot from the friction generated during the high-speed abort. The crew, however, did not lose focus on the critical task at hand. In a tense few seconds, the aircraft finally came to a stop, just 1,500 meters from the stationary E190. Under different circumstances, this distance could have easily been the scene of a catastrophic collision. Tension gradually subsided once both aircraft had stopped on the runway. Arriving quickly to assess the situation were emergency services who were already on alert because of the bird strike. The Boeing 777 exited the runway and waited for 45 minutes to allow the brakes to cool before returning to the terminal, while the E190 was towed back to the gate for inspection. Despite the drama, there were no reported injuries and neither aircraft was damaged. Passengers on both flights were safely disembarked. Many expressed gratitude for the quick actions of the flight crews, though some described lingering anxiety about the close call. The E190 underwent minor maintenance to address the bird strike, while the 777's brakes and tires were replaced before the aircraft was returned to service. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada, TSB, conducted a thorough investigation into the incident, uncovering several key factors that contributed to the near catastrophe. Central to the event was the bird strike on the Embraer E190, which necessitated the rejected takeoff. Compounding the situation, a malfunction in the E190's transponder sent incorrect signals to the Runway Incursion Monitoring and Conflict Alert System, RIMCAT, preventing it from issuing timely warnings. Additionally, overlapping radio transmissions hampered the E190 crew's ability to communicate their decision to abort the takeoff effectively. ATC was also found to have been focused on other incoming traffic, which delayed their situational awareness of the unfolding crisis. The TSB highlighted the controller's physical operating position in the tower as a contributing factor, noting that their shift in focus delayed the detection of the runway conflict. Despite no injuries or damage, the incident underscored the critical importance of vigilance and redundancy in aviation systems. In response to these findings, the TSB recommended improvements to runway monitoring systems and emphasized the need for redundancy in critical communication protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. While no sweeping changes were made, the incident served as a critical reminder of the importance of accurate communication and monitoring systems. Airlines and airports reviewed their use of RIMCAT and similar technologies, with several opting for upgrades to reduce the risk of miscommunication. Ultimately, it appears that this occurrence was the result of a series of minor mistakes that were exacerbated by a bird strike. To make matters worse, the E190 was transmitting an incorrect status, which caused air traffic control and the 777 to take longer to respond. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.